The wind moved like a memory, restless, searching, unable to settle. It howled through the pine-covered slopes of the Hintermoor Mountains, stirring flurries of snow that clung to the edges of the narrow cabin perched on a lonely ridge. Inside, Elias Hart sat hunched over a wooden table, sanding the frame of a half-finished violin, though his hands had long since stopped moving. He stared at the curve of the wood as if it could answer questions the world never dared to. The hearth crackled softly behind him. Firelight played across the old pine floors, casting trembling shadows that danced like ghosts. Mira sat curled in the corner of the room, her small frame wrapped in a hand-woven shawl, her sketchbook open on her knees. She wasn't drawing anything, just tracing the same spiral over and over again, as if trying to drill into the heart of something only she could see. She hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. People in the nearby town of Weatherfell whispered about Elias Hart, the widowed carpenter who never smiled, the man who speaks to no one, whose daughter is mute as a gravestone. But they didn't know. They hadn't seen Alara, his wife, collapse in his arms that day beneath the falling snow, crimson blooming against white like a rose shattering. They hadn't heard Myra's scream that split the air like lightning, only to vanish, as if she'd locked her voice away forever with her mother's spirit. Now, every morning began in silence and ended in silence. Elias would rise before dawn, brew tea he rarely drank, and check the fire. Then he would work. Wood responded to him in ways people never had. Yielding, honest, needing patience but never pretending. He crafted furniture for clients he never met, string instruments for students he never heard play. Each piece he made bore the same inscription hidden inside. Still breathing. Reminder. Plea. Sometimes, when the ache in his chest became unbearable, he would play one of his violins. Music was the only thing that could make Mira lift her head. She would sit close to the sound, her wide eyes shimmering like glass, never blinking, as if afraid the notes would disappear if she looked away. He had once tried to teach her to hold the bow, but her fingers trembled too much. It wasn't that she didn't understand. It was that something inside her had frozen solid. Like a lake beneath ice, alive but unreachable. Elias watched her now, the way her dark hair slipped across her cheek as she leaned over the page. He wondered, not for the first time, if she blamed him. Or worse, if she didn't blame anyone at all. If she had simply accepted that life was full of disappearance, and silence was the only language grief spoke fluently. The snow thickened outside. A branch thudded softly against the window pane, startling neither of them. Elias's hands resumed sanding the violin, the rhythm as unconscious as a heartbeat. Mira turned a page in her sketchbook and began drawing a tree, tall, bare, and standing alone in a storm. Neither said a word. But somewhere, beneath the hush of falling snow and the ache of memory, something had begun to stir, a shift too faint to name. As if the wind itself was bearing news. As if the forest was about to bring them something that would force the silence to break, and hearts long buried to rise again. The storm had not been forecasted. It came without warning, rolling in from the northern cliffs with a ferocity that erased the horizon and swallowed the trees in a curtain of white. By mid-afternoon, the world beyond the cabin had vanished, leaving only the moan of wind and the thick silence of falling snow. Elias stood by the window, mug in hand, watching the forest disappear. The steam from the tea curled against the glass, fogging it briefly before dissolving like breath. He didn't remember making the tea. His thoughts had drifted, as they often did in recent years, to a place where time moved without him. Mira was asleep in the loft, curled under wool blankets with her sketchbook still in her lap. She'd drawn all morning without pause. Trees without leaves, branches stretching toward nothing, and a pair of small eyes peeking from beneath a snowbank. He hadn't asked. He rarely did. There was something sacred in her silence, something he had learned not to disturb. The knock was so faint he thought it was the wind. Then again, harder this time. He blinked and turned sharply toward the door. No one ever came this far up the ridge, especially in weather like this. The townspeople knew better. He stood motionless, Heartbeat slow and deep in his chest like the pounding of a drum in a forgotten cave. The knock came once more. Elias set down the mug and crossed the room, fingers brushing the old hunting knife hanging on the wall, more out of habit than suspicion. When he opened the door, the wind slammed into him like a freight train, ice and cold clawing at his face. And then he saw them. 2 little girls. Barefoot. Twins. They stood huddled together, their arms wrapped around each other, their faces raw with windburn, lips blue, snow clinging to their tangled blonde hair like frost in spider silk. One of them, slightly taller, looked up at him with eyes that did not match. One green. One a strange, stormy gray. Eyes too old for her face. Eyes that had seen something she shouldn't have. The other girl swayed slightly, eyelids fluttering. Elias dropped to his knees without thinking. "Jesus," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "You'll freeze." He scooped them up, one in each arm, and pulled them inside. The warmth of the fire hit their skin like a slap. They didn't cry. They didn't speak. The taller one clung to her sister as if separating them would break something final. Mira had awoken without a sound. She stood at the edge of the loft, barefoot and wide-eyed, her sketchbook falling from her hands to the wooden floor with a soft thump. Later, he would wonder if she had seen them before he did. If some part of her, whatever thread still tethered her to her lost voice, had sensed their coming. Elias placed the girls near the hearth, wrapping them in blankets, whispering soothing nonsense as he checked for frostbite. They were ice-cold but alive. The smaller one, Elsie, he would learn her name later, shivered violently and then went still. Not unconscious, just silent. Mira. He boiled water, made broth, crushed firewood into the stove until the room grew thick with heat. Mira watched him with an intensity that unsettled him. Then, without being asked, she knelt beside the strangers and touched the edge of their blanket. Her hand rested gently on the older girl's fingers. No words, just a connection. Bridge. Elias didn't ask questions. Not that night. The storm howled outside like a beast hunting in the dark. He moved between the girls and the fire and his tools like a man in a trance. It wasn't until the flames began to dim and the girls were wrapped in sleep that he allowed himself to sit. He looked at Mira. She was still watching them. "I don't know who they are," he said softly, almost to himself. But Mira, for the first time in years, moved her lips. No sound came out, just a shape. "They found us." He stared at her, breath caught in his throat. She hadn't spoken, but she had answered. He turned his gaze back to the twins. Mysterious, frost-bitten children dropped into his world like omens. Something had changed. Not just in the rhythm of his days, but in the marrow of his bones. These girls had come from something. Or run from something. And whatever it was bigger than the storm. Bigger than silence. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the violin on the table remained unfinished. But something else had begun to take form. A melody neither he nor Mira had ever played, rising slow and inevitable from the silence like breath returning to frozen lungs. In the weeks that followed, the snow did not melt. It thickened, as if the forest had made a pact with winter to preserve the strange stillness that had settled over Elias's cabin. Time became less linear. The days bled into each other like watercolors left too long in the rain. The twins, Lena and Elsie, spoke little at first. Lena, the elder by minutes, carried herself with a peculiar alertness, as if she were constantly listening for something beyond the walls. Elsie, on the other hand, clung to silence with a kind of trembling obedience. When she slept, it was restless, limbs twitching beneath her blanket, breath catching on imagined threats. Mira often curled up beside her without a word, and something about that silent companionship steadied the little girl. Elias watched it all with growing unease. He had always believed that grief was a wound with a beginning and end, that losing Hannah had carved a single permanent scar across his life. But now, with 3 fragile souls under his roof, that old wound throbbed again, pulsing with echoes of memories he had long buried. His cabin, once a shelter from the past, now became a mirror reflecting it. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, He stood at his workbench, carving the bridge of the unfinished violin. The motion was familiar, hand, blade, wood, but his focus was not. Mira sat nearby, sketching with an intensity that disturbed him. Her page was filled not with trees or snow but with shadows. Shapes with no clear faces, hunched and looming. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. What was there to say? That her drawings frightened him. That he, a grown man, felt haunted in his own home. He turned back to his work, but his hands shook. That night the dreams returned. He was running through the forest, barefoot, bleeding. Mira was calling out to him, but with no voice. The sound was a violin string stretched too tight, screaming in pitch but not in words. Then he saw her, Hannah, standing at the edge of the cliff, holding out her arms, eyes empty as the winter sky. And behind her a figure. Not Lena. Not Elsie. Something darker. Watching. Always watching. He woke drenched in sweat, the echo of the violin string still in his ears. He found Mira in the corner of the room, eyes wide awake. Her drawings were scattered around her like fallen leaves. One caught his eye. It was him. His face, drawn in charcoal, but beneath the skin were cracks, jagged and black like veins filled with ash. His chest was open, and instead of a heart, there was a tiny violin curled like a dying flower. He knelt beside her, trembling. "Mira," he whispered. But she didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the window. Outside, in the white distance between the trees, stood a figure. Elias stood so fast he nearly tripped. He rushed to the door, yanked it open, but there was nothing. The snow. Stillness. A trick of the night. He told himself that. Over and over. But something in him twisted. Not fear exactly, something deeper. Recognition. The next morning, Lena sat by the fire, threading beads onto a string Mira had given her. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully. She didn't look up when Elias entered, but she spoke. "He's coming," she said simply. Elias froze. "Who?" Lena didn't answer. She tied the string, set it on her lap, and stared into the flames. He wanted to demand more. Shake answers out of the child. But then he saw the way Elsie flinched at her sister's tone, how Mira put her hand on Elsie's knee in quiet protection. And something inside Elias softened, not from understanding but from a deeper instinct. These girls had not come to him by accident. They had been running from something. And that something had followed. That night, he found himself playing the violin again. Not the new one. The old one, Hannah's. The one he had sworn never to touch again. It creaked under his fingers like a ghost woken from sleep. The bow stuttered at first, but then, like breath through cracked lips, it began to sing. Not a song of joy or peace, but one of ache, one of longing, one of fear masked by tenderness. Mira sat at his feet, eyes closed. Lena held Elsie in her lap, rocking gently in time with the music. In that moment, Elias realized something that terrified him. He loved them. Not just Mira. Not just the memory of his wife. But the twins. These strange, broken girls with their secrets and shadows. His heart, brittle as it had become, had cracked open again. And in that widening space, affection had taken root. But love, he knew too well, was not safe. Made you weak. Made you reckless. And it made you a target. As the fire dimmed and the song drew to a close, he looked once more at the window. And though there was nothing there, he felt it. The presence. The watchful silence just beyond the trees. The past was not done with him. And the girl's story was far from over. The forest grew colder. Not by temperature alone. Though even Elias, who had spent years building his tolerance to the Adirondack winters, noticed the way frost now formed inside the windows, like delicate white veins crawling closer each morning. No, it was something else. A creeping stillness. The kind that made the trees lean in too close. The kind that made firewood crack with unfamiliar tension. It was as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. And Mira had stopped drawing. At first, he hadn't noticed. The days were crowded with chores, keeping the fire fed, food rationed, keeping the girls warm, calm, alive. But one evening, as he packed away his tools, he saw her blank sketchbook. Clean pages. No charcoal marks. No shadows. No dreams. Just absence. He asked nothing, because a part of him feared the answer. The twins were quiet, more than usual. Lena had become fiercely protective, especially of Mira. She no longer let Elsie out of her sight. When Elias asked simple things, "Do you want tea?" or "Are you warm enough?" Lena would answer, but always with a guarded stiffness, like she was measuring every word for betrayal. And Elsie? She had stopped making eye contact altogether. She moved like a phantom through the cabin, her small body tense, coiled, waiting. Waiting for what? Elias didn't know. But he felt it too. Something was coming. That night he dreamed again. The violin was on fire, and he stood helpless before it, strings snapping one by one like nerve endings. Mira was there, watching him burn from the inside out. Behind her, Lena and Elsie stood in identical dresses, holding hands. But their eyes were mirrors, and when he looked into them, he saw himself drowning, flailing, alone. He woke gasping. The cabin was silent, too silent. The fire had gone out. He moved quickly, half blind, fumbling for kindling. As he lit the match, the flame trembled, flickering longer than it should before catching. And in that flickering moment, he saw Elsie, standing in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dark. Her eyes were open, staring at him. He approached slowly. "Elsie." She didn't move. "Are you cold?" he whispered, kneeling before her. "Do you want to come back to bed?" And then, in a voice so hoarse it cracked the air, she spoke. "He's here." Elias froze. It wasn't just the words. It was the terror behind them, raw, primal. Not just fear of a person, but of memory. Of pain revisited. Her lips quivered. Her hands clutched at the hem of her nightdress. He reached for her shoulder, but she recoiled violently. Lena shot up from her bed, eyes wide, defensive. "Don't touch her," she hissed. Mira awoke then, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she made a sound. It wasn't a word, it was a gasp. Sharp, desperate. She bolted to Elsie, wrapped her arms around the trembling girl, and pulled her into the warmth of her chest. Elsie broke. Her body convulsed with sobs, her mouth open in a scream without sound, until finally. "He locked us in the cellar," she whimpered. Elias sat back as if struck. No one moved. Lena's jaw tightened. Mira stared at the floor. And Elsie, precious, mute Elsie, kept talking. Between choked breaths, between Myra's steadying hands and Lena's bristling silence, the story began to spill. A house in the woods. A man with angry hands and a voice like thunder. A cellar with no windows. Food through a slot in the door. Days without sunlight. Promises made in lies. Songs whispered in the dark to stay sane. And Mira, sweet, broken Mira, was the one who sang. The one who made the horror a little less real. "He said we'd die if we left," Elsie sobbed. "Said no one would care. Said we were his now." Elias closed his eyes, chest heavy with fury. But it wasn't just the story. It was the voice. Elsie had spoken. He should have felt triumph, relief, a sign of healing. Instead he felt guilt. Because only now, only when the darkness had spilled into words, did he fully see the depth of their wounds. What he thought were shadows were in fact bruises on the soul, layers of trauma layered so carefully that even their silence had been a form of survival. Later that night, he sat by the fire, the violin untouched beside him. Mira lay curled with Elsie in her lap, Lena watching over them like a sentinel. He looked at the three of them, these orphans of violence, of memory, and he realized something he had not dared admit before. He wasn't just their shelter. He was their lifeline. And if the man who did this ever came near them again, Elias knew what he would do. He would kill for them. The flame crackled in the hearth. And outside, beneath the moonless sky, footsteps passed through the snow. The morning came with no light. Just a gray suffocation of sky, the kind that presses down like a weight on the chest. Elias sat at the table, staring into a chipped mug of untouched tea. Mira, Lena, and Elsie were still asleep. Finally, deeply. After the night's unraveling, exhaustion had pulled them into something like peace. But Elias couldn't rest. Not with the echo of Elsie's voice still lodged in his mind like a splinter. He felt ashamed of how little he'd asked until now. Ashamed, too, of the part of him that had wanted to keep their past buried beneath the snow, beneath the music, beneath the fragile illusion of a new life. But trauma did not yield to silence. It waited, patiently. And it had waited long enough. The twins' tattered coats lay in a heap by the wood stove, still dusted faintly with snow from weeks ago, as if they'd been frozen in time the day they arrived. Elias reached for Lena's first, thicker, stiff with wear. He sifted through the pockets gently, half expecting to find nothing but lint and dust. But then he felt it, a crumple. Paper old and fragile. He pulled it free. A letter folded twice, then once more. Edges frayed. The ink smudged. His fingers trembled as he opened it, and with each word his breath slowed, then hitched. To whomever finds them, if anyone ever does, please forgive me. I did not know how deep the evil ran. I thought I could save them. I thought love would be enough. The man is not their father. He is a thief of souls. A liar with God's name on his lips and filth beneath his nails. He came for me first. Then the girls. He said we were chosen. Said no one would understand if we left. That the world would call us ungrateful, mad. I stayed too long. I was too afraid. But I am not afraid now. Take care of them, please. Tell them I sang until the end. Their mother, Mirabelle. The name hit him like an axe to the ribs. He read the letter again, slower, the words bleeding into the shape of a woman he'd never met, yet felt he somehow knew. A mother who had traded her life for her daughter's chance at freedom. A mother who had lived in fear but died in love. Who had wrapped a confession in the folds of a coat, knowing full well that she might not be there to speak it. Elias folded the letter and held it against his chest. He imagined her, Maribel, in that house, humming through cracked lips while the man who claimed to protect them seethed with control. He pictured her slipping the letter into the coat, pressing it in as if it were her last will. Her voice, her truth, her plea for the girls to have a future beyond horror. Outside the wind howled. Elias stood, walked to the window, looked out across the snow-laden clearing. Then he saw them. Footprints, fresh. His pulse leapt into his throat. He followed the trail with his eyes, across the yard from the edge of the woods. They hadn't been there yesterday. And no storm had covered them overnight. That meant whoever had come was close. Watching, judging the moment. The door creaked behind him. He turned. Lena stood there, holding Myra's hand. Her face was pale but calm. Too calm for a child. You read it, she said. He nodded. I did. She said she'd make sure someone kind found us, Lena whispered. Her voice cracked, then steadied again. I think she meant you. Elias wanted to answer, but he couldn't speak past the emotion in his throat. He simply knelt and opened his arms. Lena didn't move. Not at first. Then she let go of Myra's hand, stepped forward and fell into him. She didn't cry. Neither did he. They just stayed like that, silent and still, until the weight in both their chests lightened just enough to breathe. Later that day, as Elias chopped wood outside, he kept glancing toward the trees. The footprints were still there, but no figure emerged. He didn't need to see him to know he existed. The man was coming. But now Elias had something he hadn't had before. Not just truth, but a reason. And reasons, he knew, were stronger than fear. The fire in the hearth had long since burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced like restless ghosts across the worn wooden walls. Elias stood by the window, eyes tracing the barren landscape beyond, the trees standing like silent sentinels against the heavy sky. The footprints remained etched into the snow, a constant reminder of a presence lurking just beyond reach, a threat that had followed them through the cold wilderness into this fragile sanctuary. Inside, the house was quiet, but Elias's mind roared with the voices of doubt, fear, and a determination born from a depth he had never plumbed before. The letter weighed heavy in his coat pocket, Maribel's final plea anchoring him to a truth he could no longer deny. He could not let the past consume them any longer. Not Mira, not Lena, not Elsie. He owed them more than shelter. He owed them hope. Every night before, he had retreated into shadows, hiding from the ghosts of his own failures, the loss of his wife, the silence of his daughter, and the unknown terrors that had clawed at these two innocent girls. But now the shadows were closing in, and hiding was no longer an option. He had to step into the light, no matter how blinding or unforgiving it might be. He took a slow, deliberate breath and let it out, steadying himself against the cold glass. The past was a prison of fear and silence, but it was also the only map he had to a future he was still too afraid to imagine. Yet imagination was no longer enough. Action was the only path forward. His gaze fell on Mira, who sat quietly at the corner, fingers gently tracing the grain of the wooden table. Her silence was not just absence of words, it was a fortress he had long wished to breach. Now, for her sake and the twins. He understood he had to break through that silence himself. Elias felt the weight of responsibility pressed down, heavier than ever. The man, the thief of souls Maribel had written about, was out there and he was coming. He was a storm that could not be outrun, a reckoning that demanded to be faced. But Elias also felt a flicker of something new, an ember of fierce resolve. If darkness was the enemy, then he would be the light. Not a flickering flame easily extinguished, but a blaze that could burn through the coldest night. He moved away from the window and walked to the small desk where the letter had rested. He took it out again, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers. Maribel's words echoed in his mind. "Take care of them, please. Tell them I sang until the end." He closed his eyes and whispered into the silence. "I hear you, Maribel. I will sing for them. I will fight for them." Elias knew the road ahead would be treacherous. He would have to confront the man whose shadow still haunted the edges of their lives. He would have to wrestle with his own demons, the guilt that had shackled him, the fears that had paralyzed him. But most of all, he would have to be brave for Mira, Lena, and Elsie. Be brave enough to step out of the darkness and into whatever storm awaited. For the first time in years, Elias felt a stirring of hope, not the fragile, fleeting kind, but something solid, forged in pain and love. He gathered the girls close, their small bodies fitting against his chest like fragile glass. No words were spoken, but in that embrace, a silent promise was made. No matter the darkness, they would face it together. And in that decision, bold and irrevocable, Elias finally stepped out of the shadows. The snow fell gently, as if the sky itself wished to hush the world into silence, wrapping the forest in a blanket of white that muted every sound except the soft crunch of footsteps. Elias moved steadily through the trees, the cold biting at his cheeks but not quite able to penetrate the armor of resolve he had forged in recent days. Myra's small hand rested in his, fragile yet steadfast, and beside them, Lena and Elsie followed closely, their wide eyes reflecting both the harshness of the world and the fragile flicker of hope he carried for them. The forest had become both a prison and a refuge, a place where past and present collided like shifting shadows. Here, the ghosts of loss mingled with the raw ache of survival, and Elias felt the weight of every step, not just on the snow, but on the fragile thread of fate binding them together. His mind was a turbulent sea of memories and fears. The faces of those lost haunted him. His wife Maribel, whose voice lingered like a haunting melody in his heart, the man he had never met but who loomed as a specter over their lives, threatening to unravel the fragile peace they had fought to build. Yet even amid the tempest of uncertainty, there was a spark, something stubborn and fierce, that refused to be extinguished. As they paused by a cluster of ancient pines, Elias looked down at Mira. Her silence was not emptiness. It was a language of its own, one he was slowly learning to understand. The way her eyes searched his, calm and steady, told him that she too carried a flame, a quiet strength born from hardship and love. He knelt in the snow, brushing a strand of hair from her face, feeling the faint pulse of life and resilience beneath her skin. "We're almost through this," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Behind them, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the next chapter in their story. The threat that shadowed their lives had not vanished. It lurked beyond the trees, a reminder that peace was fragile and fleeting. But Elias no longer felt the paralyzing fear that had gripped him for so long. The darkness was real, but so was the light, a light kindled by the bonds they shared, by the promise to protect and to fight for one another. The path ahead was uncertain, shrouded in the unknown like the drifting snowflakes. Yet in that uncertainty lay possibility. The possibility of healing, of redemption, of a future not dictated by past wounds but shaped by newfound courage. Elias rose, lifting Mira gently into his arms, and with the twins close beside him, they stepped forward, into the cold, into the silence, into whatever awaited them beyond the forest's edge. The light they carried was fragile, yes, but it was theirs. A beacon against the relentless night, a testament to the enduring power of love and hope. And as the snow continued to fall, soft and unending, it washed away the traces of fear, leaving behind only the faint glow of a new beginning.